king described this development as a personal blessing. He shared this rare update from the monarch and in his own words.
What if I told you that the biggest shock inside Buckingham Palace was not the king's illness, but the moment King Charles chose William and Catherine over Queen Camilla? In a dramatic palace announcement, Charles stepped back from key royal duties, placed Prince William at the center of royal authority, and ordered that Catherine stand beside him as the monarchy's visible future. But hidden inside the signed order was a final handwritten instruction that reportedly blocked Camilla's household from challenging William's authority. Tonight, we uncover the secret meetings, the sealed documents, and the royal humiliation that changed everything. Before we begin, like and subscribe to Crown Secrets for more explosive royal revelations. The announcement that shook Buckingham Palace. The evening began with what appeared to be a routine palace statement about King Charles's health. Broadcasters interrupted regular programming. Reporters rushed toward Buckingham Palace. Phones rang across Westminster as senior royal aides were quietly summoned into position. But this was no ordinary medical update. Inside Buckingham Palace, 2 ceremonial chairs had been placed beneath the royal crest. One was prepared for Prince William. The other was prepared for Catherine, Princess of Wales. There was no chair for Queen Camilla. When the throne room doors opened, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. William entered first, looking less like a triumphant heir and more like a man carrying a burden he had not expected to receive so soon. Catherine walked beside him in silence, composed but visibly affected. Princess Anne stood near the front, watching carefully. Charles was absent from the procession. Camilla was absent entirely. Every camera captured the same image, and before the palace explained anything, millions of viewers understood the message. The future of the monarchy had arrived earlier than expected. For months, Buckingham Palace had tried to project stability. Carefully staged photographs showed Charles reading state papers, meeting officials, and continuing his royal responsibilities. Official statements repeatedly insisted that the king remained fully engaged in his duties. Yet behind the scenes, the reality was becoming increasingly difficult to hide. Major meetings were quietly canceled. Ceremonies were shortened. Several appearances that would normally have belonged to the king were suddenly handled by Prince William. Palace staff began noticing that the transfer of responsibilities was happening far more quickly than the public realized. The decisive moment reportedly came during preparations for an important state ceremony in London. Charles arrived determined to participate in the rehearsal, but witnesses later described a troubling scene. His concentration began to drift. His responses became unusually brief. At one point, the room was reportedly cleared so that his doctors could examine him privately. Their warning was blunt. The pace had to stop. Charles was advised that continuing to carry the full burden of daily royal work could seriously damage his recovery. He needed to reduce his responsibilities immediately. That same evening, an emergency meeting was arranged at Buckingham Palace. William, Catherine, Anne, and a small group of constitutional advisors were summoned without being told the full reason. Waiting at the center of the table was a sealed folder titled Royal Continuity and Succession Order. What appeared to be a temporary health arrangement would soon become something far more significant. The sealed folder and Charles's decision. When King Charles opened the sealed folder, Prince William initially assumed it contained little more than a list of canceled engagements and temporary scheduling adjustments while the king recovered. Catherine expected a short-term delegation of duties and remained silent, prepared for what seemed likely to be a routine constitutional precaution. Instead, the document revealed something far more dramatic. The order transferred state audiences, senior palace appointments, ceremonial planning, and the monarchy's long-term strategic direction directly to Prince William. It was not simply a reduction in the king's workload, it was a significant redistribution of royal authority. Then Charles turned toward Catherine. He explained that she would assume responsibilities normally associated with a reigning queen, including state banquets, diplomatic receptions, ceremonial presentation, and oversight of the royal household's public program. The implication was enormous. Catherine would not merely support William behind the scenes. She would stand beside him as one of the most visible figures in the monarchy. The room fell completely silent. William reacted first. He immediately objected, warning that the public could easily believe he had pressured his father into stepping aside. The last thing he wanted was for the transition to appear like a son rushing toward the throne while the king was still alive. Catherine's concern was different but equally serious. She worried that appearing beside ceremonial thrones and assuming queen-like responsibilities while Charles remained monarch could be interpreted as ambition rather than duty. She understood how quickly public opinion could turn if people believed she was too eager for a future role that technically did not yet belong to her. Charles refused to let either of them carry that burden. He insisted that the decision was his alone. Pretending that his strength had not changed, he argued, would ultimately do more damage to the institution than honestly acknowledging reality. The monarchy, he believed, could not continue operating on appearances alone. But the meeting was far from over. Before the discussion could continue, Princess Anne quietly placed a second folder on the table. Inside were confidential notes originating from members of Camilla's household. The documents reportedly outlined ways to preserve Camilla's influence if Charles withdrew from active public duties. They proposed that her office remain involved in ceremonial planning, senior appointments, state banquets, charitable patronages, and the royal public program, even while William assumed broader constitutional responsibilities. One particular sentence changed the atmosphere completely. It suggested that William's expanded authority should be presented as temporary, even if Charles remained absent from public life for an extended period. William read the page once, then read it again more slowly. Catherine remained perfectly still, but the implication was unmistakable. While Charles was struggling with his health, members of Camilla's household had apparently already been discussing how to maintain their influence during his absence and prevent William from becoming the uncontested center of royal authority. Anne explained that the papers had reached her after a senior aide became uncomfortable with the discussions and believed they should be brought directly to the king's attention. The language was cautious and bureaucratic, filled with references to continuity, stability, and experience, but the underlying message was impossible to miss. Camilla's office did not appear willing to surrender its influence quietly. Charles finally asked the question everyone in the room was thinking. Did Camilla approve this? Anne answered carefully. The documents had come from her household, but they did not conclusively prove how much Camilla personally knew about the proposals or whether she had authorized them directly. For a long moment, Charles said nothing. Then he closed the folder, looked around the room, and gave a quiet but unmistakable instruction. Summon Camilla privately. What followed would become the most consequential confrontation of the entire crisis, a moment that would force Charles to choose between preserving domestic peace within his household and securing a clear, uncontested line of royal authority for the future of the monarchy. The confrontation with Camilla. When Queen Camilla entered the room, the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace changed immediately. No one raised their voice. No one greeted her warmly. King Charles remained seated at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. Princess Anne kept the confidential folder closed in front of her. Prince William stood near the fireplace with his arms folded, while Catherine sat opposite the chair that had been prepared for Camilla. The silence itself felt like an accusation. Charles broke it first. In a calm but unmistakably direct tone, he asked whether Camilla's household had been discussing the creation of an advisory council operating from Clarence House after his withdrawal from active royal duties. Camilla paused before answering. She acknowledged that members of her staff had considered various contingency arrangements, but she insisted that the discussions were about preparation, not ambition. A monarchy facing uncertainty, she argued, could not simply discard the experience of someone who had spent years beside the king, learning the complexities of royal protocol, diplomacy, and ceremonial life. Then she presented her proposal. The order transferring authority to William should be amended. Under her suggested arrangement, Camilla would retain a formal role in state banquets, ceremonial appointments, charitable patronages, and the royal public program. William would continue handling constitutional matters, and Catherine could represent the crown beside him. But Camilla's household would remain involved whenever issues of tradition, protocol, or the king's interests were concerned. On the surface, the proposal sounded measured and reasonable. In reality, it would have created two competing centers of royal authority. Catherine asked the question that cut straight through the carefully diplomatic language. Who makes the final decision when William and Camilla disagree? Camilla answered without hesitation that Charles's wishes should guide them. That single response shattered the illusion of compromise. Charles immediately understood the problem. Even while supposedly stepping back from active royal duties, he would continue being pulled into disputes between William's office and Camilla's household. Every disagreement over a ceremony, an appointment, or a public appearance would eventually return to him for arbitration. The burden he was trying to escape would simply reappear in another form. At that moment, Princess Anne quietly opened the confidential folder and pointed to one particular phrase. It described William's authority as reversible. Charles read the line in silence. Then he closed the folder. Looking directly at Camilla, he stated that no amendment would be approved that created a second court or weakened the authority of the heir to the throne. The decision, he made clear, was not about excluding her personally. It was about ensuring that the monarchy operated under one unmistakable line of command. Camilla turned toward William and asked whether this outcome was what he wanted. William's reply was calm and deliberate. "I did not write the order. My father did." For a moment, no one spoke. Camilla rose from her chair, gathered her composure, and left the room without accepting the decision. The door closed softly behind her, but everyone understood that the confrontation was far from over. After her departure, the constitutional advisor delivered a serious warning. Even if William received the authority described in the order, Camilla's household could still attempt to slow, weaken, or complicate its implementation through procedural challenges, competing interpretations, and claims of consultation rights. There was, he explained, only one way to prevent that from happening. Charles reached for the fountain pen beside the unsigned document. Instead of signing immediately, he wrote a new sentence in his own hand. "No authority granted through this document may be challenged by the Queen's household." The room fell completely silent. Typed legal language could be debated, administrative clauses could be reinterpreted, but a handwritten instruction from the king himself carried a different kind of authority. When Charles finally signed beneath that sentence, the document ceased to be merely a temporary health arrangement. That single handwritten line changed everything, transforming the order into a direct and unmistakable barrier against any future challenge from Camilla's household and firmly placing the future authority of the monarchy in William's hands. The handwritten sentence that changed the monarchy. William read the handwritten sentence once, then again, as though he needed to be certain he had not misunderstood what his father had just done. The words were brief, but their significance was enormous. The order was no longer simply a temporary medical arrangement designed to reduce the king's workload during recovery. It had become a constitutional barrier. Typed legal language could always be explained away. Advisors could be blamed for wording. Bureaucratic phrasing could be described as routine palace procedure. But a handwritten instruction from the monarch himself carried an entirely different kind of authority. It reflected personal intent, not administrative convenience. Princess Anne stepped forward and signed the document as witness. Then King Charles signed beneath the new sentence. The room remained silent as the final seal was applied. Within minutes, the order was placed in a secure envelope, and the first official copy was delivered to Clarence House before any public announcement had even been drafted. When Queen Camilla received it, she reportedly turned immediately to the final page. She read the handwritten line and stopped. The meaning was unmistakable. Her household had been formally excluded from challenging William's authority. Her advisors quickly examined whether the wording could still be softened before the decision became public. They explored whether the phrase might be interpreted more narrowly or whether additional guidance could reduce its impact. The answer they received was discouraging. The king had written the sentence personally, the royal seal had already been applied, and Princess Anne had witnessed the signature. Reopening the order would require Charles himself to reverse his own handwritten instruction. Camilla understood immediately that the door had been closed before she had been given any real opportunity to negotiate. Some members of her staff urged her to appear beside Charles during the public announcement in order to project an image of unity and continuity. Camilla rejected the suggestion. Standing beside the king while William and Catherine were presented as the new center of royal authority would look less like loyalty and more like public consent to her own exclusion. While Clarence House absorbed the shock of the decision, Buckingham Palace began moving with extraordinary speed. Communications officials drafted emergency statements. Ceremonial staff finalized positions in the throne room beneath the royal crest. Security teams revised arrival procedures. Senior government figures received restricted notice that the king would address the nation regarding the future conduct of royal duties. Charles insisted on appearing in person rather than issuing a written statement through palace channels. He wanted the country to hear directly from him that William had not demanded this transition and had not forced his father aside. A short address was prepared. It confirmed that the king's recovery required a significant reduction in duties. William would assume responsibility for state audiences, senior appointments, and long-term strategic planning, while Catherine would oversee major ceremonial functions and the royal household's public program. Then Charles added a final sentence that none of the advisors had written. The future must not wait for pride to admit what duty already knows. The line was deeply personal, almost reflective, and no one in the room asked him to remove it. Outside Buckingham Palace, crowds were already gathering behind the gates. Television networks cleared their schedules for live coverage. Reporters speculated about the scale of the announcement. Across Britain, anticipation spread rapidly as millions waited to hear what the king was about to say. What they were about to witness would become one of the most significant public moments of Charles's reign, not because it formally changed the monarchy, but because it revealed for the first time that the future of the crown was already beginning to move into William and Catherine's hands. The future arrives early. When the cameras finally went live, King Charles entered the prepared room alone. For several long seconds, he stood silently behind the lectern. The strain on his face was impossible to hide. The carefully managed palace photographs of recent months had suggested steadiness and control, but this moment revealed something much more human, a monarch carrying the visible weight of illness, responsibility, and an approaching transition he could no longer postpone. Then he began speaking. Charles told the country that duty sometimes required recognizing the difference between endurance and service. Continuing at any cost, he said, would not strengthen the monarchy. It would expose it to uncertainty and weaken the institution he had sworn to protect. With measured precision, he confirmed that Prince William would immediately assume responsibility for state audiences, senior palace appointments, and the long-term strategic direction of the royal household. Then he turned to Catherine. Charles announced that she would oversee state banquets, diplomatic receptions, ceremonial presentation, and the public program attached to the crown. He made it clear that her role was not merely symbolic. She would stand beside William whenever the monarchy needed to show the country, the Commonwealth, and the world who now carried its visible public burden. Throughout the entire address, Camilla's name was never spoken. That omission landed with extraordinary force. At Clarence House, Camilla watched the broadcast in silence. When Charles finished speaking without assigning her any continuing public role in the transition, she reportedly reached once again for the signed order and the handwritten sentence that had already sealed the outcome. The exclusion was no longer private. It had become visible to the entire nation. Back at Buckingham Palace, Charles stepped away from the lectern, and William entered through the side doors. He did not smile. Instead, he bowed his head respectfully to his father and quietly promised to honor the reign Charles had begun. Moments later, Catherine joined them, composed but visibly carrying the emotional weight of what had just happened. There was no sense of celebration in her expression, only an awareness that history had shifted around them. Then the cameras followed William and Catherine into the throne room, where two ceremonial chairs waited beneath the royal insignia. They stopped before the chairs and remained standing for a brief, suspended moment. Everyone watching understood the symbolism instantly. This was not a coronation, but it looked unmistakably like the beginning of the next era of the monarchy. After several seconds, William finally took his place. Catherine sat beside him. Within minutes, the image spread across television screens, news websites, and mobile phones around the world. Commentators immediately began debating whether Buckingham Palace had crossed an invisible constitutional line. Supporters described the scene as necessary stability during a difficult period. Critics called it a soft transfer of power carried out before any formal succession had occurred. Inside the palace, however, the reality was simpler and colder than the headlines suggested. Charles remained king. William now carried the burden of governing the monarchy's daily future. Catherine had been placed at the center of its public identity, and for the first time since Charles became king, Camilla's influence had been visibly and formally limited by the monarch himself, transforming what began as a health announcement into one of the most consequential public moments of his reign. The real shock of this royal crisis was never simply that King Charles stepped back from key duties. It was the moment he reportedly chose clarity over compromise, placing William and Catherine at the center of the monarchy's future while preventing Camilla's household from challenging their authority. Whether this proves to be a temporary arrangement or the beginning of a permanent shift in royal power, one thing is undeniable: the image of William and Catherine beneath the royal insignia has changed how millions of people see the future of the crown. Do you think Charles made the right decision? Tell us in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe to Crown Secrets for more explosive royal stories and palace revelations.